The Buyer Representation Agreement, Authority for Purchase or Lease, Form 300. This is the document that establishes the agency relationship between a buyer and the brokerage and designated representative. The Buyer Representation Agreement forms part of the representation series that I am providing through this podcast. Brick by brick, building real estate through building wealth through real estate. The Buyer Representation Agreement is the document that establishes a relationship between a buyer and the real estate company. Before the buyer signs such an agreement, the designated representative is to present the buyer with the RECO Information Guide. The RECO Information Guide is a new guide under TRESA, that is Trust in Real Estate Services Act, phase 2 of which kicked in on December the 1st, 2023. The RECO Information Guide provides a detailed description of the process through which a property is sold or bought or leased. It outlines the relationship, the different types of relationship, and the different types of representation. There are several sections to the guide. Before TRESA, the working with a realtor was just a pamphlet, a 1 or 2 page document that explained agency. The RECO Information Guide is 11 pages long. It goes into great detail the different types of agency, the different types of representation, and the rights and responsibilities of the parties involved. It outlines also the complaint process. So if a consumer has a complaint with regards to a registrant, there are steps to be completed. And the guide outlines those steps. Getting back to the Buyer Representation Agreement. All agreements have to be in writing. All agreements have to have a start and an expiry date. So the start date for the Buyer Representation Agreement is front and center, as well as the expiry date. The brokerage is named, as well as the designated representative. Prior to TRESA, there was only one type of representation, and that was brokerage representation, where all of the members of the brokerage all of the members were representing the interests of a client. And that could cause issues, as we will see when we discuss multiple representation. So designated representation was created in order to provide clarity. My brokerage, by default, uses designated representation. So that is where the representative is named in the representation agreement, and that representative provides the services and representation to the client. The brokerage provides simply the services. There's also a provision that indicate that the buyer acknowledges that the representation agreement can be for a period of 6 months or longer, but they have to provide their initials acknowledging that fact, as well as the commission. Currently in Ontario, buyer representation is a by default is a free service in the sense that the seller is the one responsible for paying the commission to both the listing brokerage and the cooperating brokerage. So it's the responsibility of the seller. That is how most seller representation agreements are worded and designed. So the buyer representation agreement indicates what the designated representative is entitled to receive. So that's what this section explains. It explains that the designated representative is entitled to receive remuneration for the services rendered, and gets that remuneration from the listing brokerage. In the event that the listing brokerage is not providing the remuneration, then it is incumbent upon the buyer to provide that payment. And that is explained during the process. So the buyer will then be responsible for paying for those services. This is the model that the US has adopted. It hasn't been adopted in Canada. But like most things, it's probably just a matter of time. This is in preparation for that. But there are also circumstances in which the buyer may just be responsible for paying for services. For example, if a property is not listed and there is no commission agreement with the seller, then the buyer will take on the responsibility of paying the brokerage and the designated representative for brokering that sale or that purchase. As well, we go on to representation. So representation is fully explained, and it also introduces the concept of multiple representation. Multiple representation will be fully explained in its own episode. It requires a great deal of explanation to make sure that it is clearly understood by buyers and sellers. As well as referral of properties. So the buyer agrees that during the occurrency of the buyer representation agreement, the buyer will act in good faith and work exclusively with the brokerage for the purchase or lease of real property of the general description indicated above. There's a section of the buyer representation agreement that describes the type of real estate that the buyer will be purchasing. The buyer agrees that during the currency of this agreement, the buyer shall advise the brokerage immediately of any property of interest. So the brokerage, the designated representative, will endeavor to locate the properties of interest for the buyer. The buyer, however, is free to do their own research, and any properties of interest shall be made immediately known to the designated representative, and then they will continue to do their duty to find out if it's an appropriate property. Finder's fee. So the buyer acknowledges that the brokerage may be receiving a finder's fee, reward, or a referral incentive. So this just indicates that the buyer acknowledges that fact and is aware of it. Consumer reports. The buyer is hereby notified that a consumer report containing credit and or personal information may be referred to in connection with this transaction. It's clearly stated that any and all information pertaining to the buyer's creditworthiness will be made available to the designated representative. The following section includes the signatures of the parties involved, as well as a declaration of insurance of the registrant. All registrants have to have valid errors of omission insurance. And this section provides that declaration. As I mentioned earlier, all representation agreements must be in writing. There are other agreements associated with the buying of real estate. This particular agreement, the buyer representation agreement, is Form 300. Form 301 is the cancellation of a buyer representation agreement. Form 302 is the assignment of a buyer representation agreement. There's also Form 304, which is the suspension of a buyer representation agreement. All of these forms must be in writing by all parties in order for them to take effect. There are others, but for the purposes of this particular explanation, we will limit it to the buyer representation agreement and these most common forms. If you do not have access to the visual explanation through YouTube, because you're listening to this while driving or just walking or exercising, I will provide a link. There is a link in the description, in the show notes, to the YouTube episode where I go through all of the different sections of the representation agreement. As well, my contact information is in the show notes. You can reach out to me through all of my social channels. That's it for this episode of Building Wealth through Real Estate Brick by Brick. Ciao, ciao.